All right, here we go. A St. Patrick's Day weekend. Hi again, everybody. Welcome to Dialed In. I'm Thom Brennaman. I don't own anything green. Casey, you apparently don't own anything green either.
No.
Although this could be probably considered a little bit of neon green, right? This Ohio State pullover.
The little zipper
neon.
there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Green, yellow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Neon.
One of those. Neon.
Yeah. Well, happy St. Patrick's Day weekend. We come your way, as you probably know by now, twice a week. We are live on Mondays at 9:15 a.m. on Chatterbox Sports, and later we post on the Believe Network. Fridays, we are both on the Believe Network and live on Chatterbox Sports at noon following Off the Bench. You can join us on YouTube/Chatterbox Sports page. You can download us anywhere, anytime you go to download your podcast. Just search Dialed In with Thom Brennaman, and you're dialed in. On Fridays, we like to do what's called our big interview. We had Chip Carey from the Cardinals 3 weeks ago. 2 weeks ago, Chris Myers from Fox Sports. Last week, legendary Chicago columnist Barry Rosner kind enough to join us. And coming on today, Justin Williams, sports writer and columnist for The Athletic, to talk about the NCAA tournament, the college football playoff, and the NIL debate. I can't wait to learn more about this because I got to be honest with you, I don't understand most of it, and I'm going to try to have Justin explain it. I don't know if anybody understands all of it, but we're going to find out here in a few minutes. You can always follow us on X at Thom Brennaman TV, and it's great to have you with us. Big weekend in sports coming up on the local front in college basketball. Both UC and Xavier, barring miracle runs in the Big 12 and Big East Conference tournaments, appear they are headed for the NIT this season. UC wraps up its regular season at home against West Virginia Saturday. Xavier will host Marquette. We know that Dayton is a shoe-in for the NCAA tournament. And I tell you what, couple of schools to keep an eye on, playing really good basketball right now. My alma mater, the Ohio University, they've won 9 out of 10 games. They're now in second place in the MAC. They face rival Miami and Oxford on Saturday. And Ohio State wraps up the regular season at Rutgers on Sunday. Both the Bobcats and the Buckeyes could make runs in their postseason tournaments, which begin next week. 3 games certainly to keep an eye on over the weekend if you got the time. Kansas plays at number 1 Houston. Number 15 Kentucky is at number 4 Tennessee. And 7th-ranked North Carolina looks for a season sweep playing at Cameron Indoor Stadium against number 9 Duke. Justin Williams is a born and raised Cincinnatian. He's written for The Athletic 6 years now. Hard to believe it's been around that long. Starting originally as a beat writer, following the University of Cincinnati in both football and basketball. But now he's kind of like, gone to the big time. He's a big national guy now, especially all things involving college basketball's best conference, the Big 12. And he's kind enough to join us on Dialed In today. Justin, I hope you're doing well, my friend, and happy St. Patrick's Day weekend.
I appreciate you having me on today.
It's my pleasure. Now, look, I made the comment. You grew up in Cincinnati. I'm assuming you always loved sports. What was it that led you to want to be a sports writer?
Honestly, I wanted to be a journalist mostly. In high school, I kind of enjoyed working for the school paper, knew I wanted to go into journalism. I, too, am an Ohio University graduate like yourself, hoping the Bobcats can make a nice run in the MAC tournament. But, and so, as much as I love sports and, sports writing was kind of a natural part of my interest in journalism, it wasn't necessarily like what I pursued. I started working in magazines right out of college, regional magazines mostly, and did some sports writing for them, but, wasn't kind of specifically on that track. But I think it just, when the Athletic started expanding and came to Cincinnati, it was kind of like a perfect opportunity to pair, like you said, my love of sports growing up and obviously an interest in something I had written about with, my chosen profession and passion, which was journalism. So, in this industry, it doesn't always work out that well or that nicely. So I'm definitely appreciative of the opportunity I've had at the Athletic for the past 6 years now.
I have always been critical is not the right word. When you look at broadcasting specifically, and Ohio University has a great broadcasting school. They have a phenomenal Scripps School of Journalism. And I always felt like the one thing that I thought OU did as well, if not better than almost everybody, maybe it is everybody, I don't know, is that they give students a chance early on to find out if it's something that A, they like, B, if they're any good at it, as opposed to waiting to say their junior year, and then all of a sudden they've spent all this money either on a student loan or their parents are paying for it. Now all of a sudden they got to change majors. For somebody who's out there thinking about Ohio University, what would you say to them in that regard?
Yeah, I mean, I had a great experience there, and it kind of worked out perfectly. Again, I knew I wanted to go into journalism. You mentioned Scripps; they've always had a good journalism school. My dad went to Ohio University, had some aunts and uncles, so it was something that was kind of always in my family, even though they didn't study journalism there. Journalism school gets a bad rap a lot of times, almost exclusively from people in the industry, because it is hard to kind of replicate the real world experience, within a college, within a school.
Yep.
I got a lot of benefit from it. So I'm if people aren't big fans of J School, I'm not gonna proselytize to them, but just in my experience, I did feel like I got some real world kind of boots on the ground experience with reporting. I also just benefited from having great professors and kind of great mentors. My college advisor was someone who had worked in the industry a long time, and I think really kind of she understood my interest in feature writing, long form writing, and kind of nudged me towards magazines when initially that I wasn't totally sure what area of journalism I wanted to work in. And I think that really benefited me. And, she did a good job of opening up my eyes to the fact that you don't always have to work at a big, glossy national magazine. There's a lot of publications. I worked at regional magazines for the first 6-7 years of my life out of college. And, because they're smaller staffs and smaller resources, you get to do so many things and have to do so many different things. I got to edit, I got to report, I got to write, I got to fact check, which is something that has, impacted me measurably as a journalist. And so all those things were kind of areas that I don't know that I would have sought out or been interested in if not for my experience at Ohio University. And so outside of just Athens being a great place and loving that experience, I took a lot of benefit from my experience there, and I'm really grateful for it.
You started at the Athletic. You mentioned, and I had said that you were on the UC beat. Look, I've grown up around beat writers my whole life, knowing some of the names you might recognize or not. The Hal McCoys and the Bob Hertzels and the Ritter Collettes and all these guys that were following the Reds when my dad first started with the team in the early 1970s. I've always wondered, being a beat writer, how fine a line is it, Justin, between the relationships you build with the people that, quite honestly, you need to help you do your job, right? I mean, I saw the same thing as a broadcaster, but then there are times where you have to criticize. Where is that fine line when you're a beat writer?
Yeah, it's tough. It was tough for me to kind of navigate. I had never done a beat before I got to the Athletic. I kind of jumped into it, and I think in some ways I benefited from having a little bit of a different background. And in some ways, I think I kind of struggled and had to figure that out. In terms of the relationship aspect, people have asked me this before. I think the most important thing is showing up and being there and asking smart questions and putting in the work. Coaches, college coaches, professional coaches, whoever, they notice that stuff. That's their job. They're paying attention to how players handle things in practice, handle things in games. And as much as they might claim they're not reading or paying attention to the media narratives, they know who shows up. They know who asks, the right questions or the smart questions. And even if they're not reading word for word what you write, they have a pretty good sense of what you're putting out there. And so, my biggest thing was just show up, try and be fair, try and do the job to the best of my ability. And if it was a situation where I felt like I had to be critical, to do that and try and do it fairly and honestly, but also make myself available to whoever I was criticizing. Mm-hmm. So, if you can, reach out to someone, whether it's in a press conference setting or maybe even kind of a background situation, and just say, here's what I'm going to write, or here's what I think. What do you think about that? Or even doing it afterwards. Sometimes that might even be better because it doesn't necessarily give you a chance to have your opinion colored one way or another. But if you're critical of something, show up. Make sure you show up the next day. Make sure you take the call. My thing with coaches was always like, hey, if I write something you think is wrong or unfair, please call me. There's no way I can get better or do my job better if I don't know that. Some coaches don't do that. Some coaches took that invitation and would call and tell me. And I appreciated that. But it's definitely something when you're there every day and you have to deal with these people. You're right that it's different than being a columnist or being a feature writer where you kind of just swoop in and have your big piece that week or for one time only, and then you can kind of get out of there and not have to live with the consequences. It's not the same on the beat, but you also have to remember that you're beholden to your readers. You're beholden to the audience and not to the team that you're covering. And so if, you're doing your job well and fairly, that's going to require you to be critical sometimes. It's going to require you to have some hard truths sometimes. And if a coach or a organization or whatever gets mad at that, that's fine. Hopefully you did your job fairly and accurately, and that anger can only take them so far. But you do have to remember that even if you're going to tick off the wrong person or make your life a little bit more difficult on a beat perspective, that's fine because you're not writing for the coach or the team or the organization. You're writing for the readers.
All right. I know this is a really broad question, and I'm going to try to just, chip away at some of this stuff because, as I mentioned in the monologue, Justin, I don't understand so much of it. I mean, I remember growing up, the NCAA was this. They were the overseer of all of this, no matter what it was. Then all of a sudden, things started to change a little bit when the BCS came around. And I was directly involved in all that and broadcast a number of those national championship games when that was alive. Then all of a sudden, we'll get to some of the college football playoff stuff in a minute. But I want to ask you, the current state of college athletics, it seems like there is no direction or leadership. Do you agree with that? And if that's true, why is that?
I actually think this is a problem that has accrued over time. Charlie Baker, who's the new NCAA president, I think has been tried to be proactive and tried to have some of that leadership. I think the issue for a long time is that Mark Emmert, the longtime previous president, did not take that same approach. The NCAA under Emmert was always criticized for being reactive or kind of, fighting the fight against this longstanding amateurism model that was clearly changing with all of the money involved and things like that. So, I'm not saying I agree with everything that Charlie Baker has done in his year or so as president or is doing. But I do think when he stepped into that role, he was really fighting an uphill battle from an NCAA perspective. And I think he has made efforts to be more proactive, obviously with the NCAA's best interest in mind. But so I just think the problem was for so long, the NCAA did not have that leadership, did not have any kind of foresight and structure in place. And so now as all of these legal battles are kind of coming to a head and all of this money has gone from, well, that's what's just giving us more TV and more audience. Now it's starting to, well, are we going to start paying the players? Is there an employment? All of these things have kind of been brewing for a long time, and now this reckoning is coming. And I think the NCAA just is in a tough spot because for so long they either ignored or tried to push that off, and now it's kind of come to a head, and they're struggling with how to deal with it.
All right, help me with this now, because I've read where people have written this or said it, heard it, whatever it might be, but I don't know. Does the NCAA govern schools that are part of football and the college football playoff? Now, I know they govern them from, let's say, an infraction standpoint. Right now, the investigation at Michigan or wherever else is anything going on. But are they still the governing body of what we know as a college football playoff?
So this is where you get into the weeds. No, the NCAA actually is not involved in the college football playoff the same way it is in the March Madness NCAA tournament. The NCAA puts that on. They don't have anything to do with the organizing and hosting of college football playoff games and kind of the money and all that's tied into that. But like you mentioned, it's still the NCAA. They're still the governing body of college sports in general, and they're the governing body of all of these institutions that have football teams that play in the college football playoff. So it's a lot of kind of like gray in the weeds area. But when you hear people talk about, football breaking off and college football, whether it's the SEC and the Big Ten or just kind of this like upper tier of power conference teams breaking football away from the NCAA, the main reason that's even kind of feasible or relevant is because the college football playoff, which is the ranking structure and the playoff structure, the postseason structure for college football, is separate from the NCAA.
Okay. All right. Okay. So let's get to the college football playoff. Beginning this fall and into the new year, we're going to have a 12-team playoff. But now all of a sudden there are all these conversations, and you're privy to some of this stuff and the people that you deal with. Now all of a sudden they're talking about 14 teams. We haven't even had a 12-team playoff yet. Is there any rhyme or reason to any of it?
No, and it goes back to the same lack of leadership problem. Not only is the NCAA not involved in the college football playoff, but there's just, no one who's looking out, I think, for the best overall interest of the sport. You have people like, Greg Sankey and Tony Petitti. Sankey's the commissioner of the SEC. Petitti's the commissioner of the Big Ten. Those two conferences clearly hold the most power and sway within college football. And those conferences are going to act in their own best interest. And that's why you're seeing this move towards a potential 14-team playoff before we've even gotten to the 12-team playoff. To go back a couple years, I think it would have been 2021 when like the first kind of plans for the 12-team playoff were released. And honestly, for people that follow college football, that love the sport, it was one of those moments where everyone was kind of like, actually, this seems like a good idea. There's some, just distribution of benefits. There's some, sharing of the wealth in a sense that there was automatic qualifiers for conference championships, but there was also at-large bids, and the quote-unquote group of 5 teams were going to have an automatic qualifier. And I think everyone kind of looked at this and felt like, oh, there's some sacrifices here being made by the SEC and by Notre Dame and some of the bigger programs, and everyone seemed to like it. And then, I think a month later is when the SEC's, took Oklahoma and Texas, and that kind of set off this next round of realignment. And Greg Sankey, who's the SEC commissioner, was on this 12-team playoff committee with Bob Bowlesby, who was the Big 12 commissioner at the time. And it was like these two people were working on this thing that everyone in college sports kind of seemed to like and was excited about. And it kind of that was the kind of the start of it fracturing. And now we have a little bit of an adjusted 12-team model because the Pac-12 has since disintegrated. Mm-hmm. And now before we even play this 12-team model, we're talking about a 14-team model that could have multiple automatic bids for the Big Ten and the SEC and automatic buys. And it's really kind of spiraled into, once again, college football having no leadership or oversight, and taking something that for very briefly college football fans were really excited about and finding a way to completely kind of muck it up with money and power struggles and all the other issues that have beleaguered the sport for a long time.
Okay, you get into the competition part of this thing, though, and in this 14-team at least model or discussion that's going on, correct me if I'm wrong here, you had the Big Ten, besides the automatic qualifiers for a conference championship, the Big Ten and the SEC would have 3 teams in there, if I've read correctly. The Big 12 and the Atlantic Coast Conference would have 2. Notre Dame would be guaranteed a spot if they're ranked in the top 14. For competition's sake, are those good ideas?
I would argue no, because the automatic qualifiers, there's just no basis for that within American sport outside of, if you win your conference championship, that made sense in the 12-team model. You win a conference championship, you get a bye if you're one of the top 4 teams, or an automatic spot for like the best group of 5 team, essentially. In this sense, if you're like the 3rd best Big Ten team or the 3rd best SEC team, you don't even make it to your conference championship game, you're guaranteed a spot in the playoff. I don't see how that benefits the sport from a competitive standpoint. Also, again, this is all proposed. There's been nothing approved with this 14-team model. But one of the things being talked about is there would be, in a 14-team structure, there would be only 2 teams that receive buys initially, and it would automatically go to the Big Ten champion and the SEC champion.
Yeah.
Meaning if, there's some one-loss champions in those conferences and there's a Big 12 or ACC team that is clearly the best team in the country and goes undefeated, they still wouldn't get a bye because they wouldn't be in one of these 2 super conferences. All of that stuff just seems completely antithetical to me from a, competitive, wide open sport, which is honestly the reason college football went to this playoff format in the first place, because there was a lot of angst over the BCS and a computer ranking, picking the top 2 teams and not having a chance for that 3rd or 4th place team to prove itself on the field. Now there's going to be a little bit more entryway. There's going to be more paths for teams to get into the playoff with more spots. But if you're already guaranteeing one to, the 2nd and 3rd place teams in different conferences, purely because of essentially the amount of money those conferences make from TV contracts, that to me just doesn't make sense in terms of being healthy for the sport from a competitive standpoint, even if it's still going to give us good games that everyone's going to watch.
Okay. All right, now I want to get into NIL, because this is an area that for the life of me, maybe it's just way above my pay scale. In its most basic definition, name, image, likeness. Theoretically, what is the most basic definition of NIL?
It would be that college athletes who for a long time could not use their own brand, their own likeness to make money, meaning they couldn't sell a jersey in the team store with their name on the back and profit off of that. They couldn't do a commercial for a local business, profit off that. Or, kind of going back to the one example that everyone knows is the video games, the college video games. They didn't have their names in it, but it was pretty clear that the games were representing players on the team and they weren't receiving any money for that. So a lot of this stemmed from the Austin case. This is where we really get into the legal weeds here. But the Austin case that went to the Supreme Court a few years ago, and the Supreme Court, basically said in a 9-0 decision that colleges couldn't stop, athletes from earning any compensation through the school or things like that. It wasn't specifically tied to NIL, but the Supreme Court basically made it known you can't stop college athletes from earning money. And so the NCAA opened up the floodgates on NIL, which basically said if state wants to pass a law or federal government wants to pass a law, players can start earning this NIL money, which in practice made total sense and has happened. There are athletes who, go on a commercial for a national brand, or who do an autograph signing at a local restaurant and make money. All that stuff is happening. But obviously what it then kind of devolved into is a pay-for-play model, where NIL was the cover or shell company, used to basically mask teams paying players to come be a part of their program.
Okay, so if I understand you correctly, and I'm actually a little bit shocked that I think that's what I thought it was, but NIL is completely if you pick Ohio State, okay? So there's the athletic department at Ohio State. There's this governing body that they're under the umbrella of the NCAA. NIL is a completely you just used the term shell company, which is a perfect description, right? They are a completely separate entity. So in other words, schools are not allowed to directly pay players. Is that accurate?
That was accurate up until this recent Tennessee court case that, probably people have seen in the news. But yes, initially and in practice, the idea was colleges, athletic programs could not in any way fund athletes, pay players directly. But what was happening was these things called collectives popped up, which were very clearly tied to different institutions. And, they would say, well, yeah, we'll sign you to a deal with this car dealership or this local restaurant, whatever. They can't specifically say if you come play for the Ohio State Buckeyes or the Tennessee Volunteers or whoever, but it was very clear that was what was happening. And all of it has kind of just evolved into these collectives, more or less working with the programs that they support and saying, all right, so if a team really wants this transfer or recruit to come play for them, okay, well, the collective offers them X amount of dollars with whatever, requirements. You do a social media post or something like that. But it was pretty clearly pay for play. And that's what happened with Tennessee is they had a quarterback who was a high school recruit who the collective, paid to come on a private jet and basically signed to a deal, more or less meaning if you come play for Tennessee, this is how it's going to work. Mm-hmm. And so because pay for play was not allowed, the NCAA said, well, you're going to get sanctioned for that. This all happened a couple years ago because nothing in the NCAA happens that quickly. And so Tennessee fought it, and there was a lawsuit filed in the state of Tennessee, I think with maybe the state of Virginia as well. And basically a judge decided you can't stop these players from earning money. It breaks antitrust law. And so under that decision, which is just a temporary injunction, I believe, meaning it hasn't kind of been permanent. But for right now, the idea being, yeah, you actually can pay players to come play for you because otherwise it would be an antitrust violation. So this is all part of the many legal battles the NCAA is fighting. And I want to clarify, I'm not a lawyer, so don't anyone listening take my advice as gospel on the legal front. But in a broad sense, that's kind of what's happened, which was pay for play was clearly happening under the guise of NIL for the past couple years, and this court case basically kind of lifted the hood on all of that and said, yeah, this is the way it's happening, and that's fine, that's legal. In fact, if you're a program trying to stop that, if you're the NCAA trying to stop that from happening, that would be an antitrust violation. And so it's completely upended what you mentioned, which was the decades-long, century-long NCAA model of amateurism.
Okay, you may or may not know the answer to this. So, again, I'll just stick with Ohio State since we talked about them. Does Ryan Day know when he is recruiting a player? Okay, let's say he's recruiting quarterback X from Cincinnati. And now all of a sudden, this guy's comparing this high school quarterback is looking around at all these other schools, USC and Miami of Florida, whoever it is, Oklahoma, Texas. Does the coach have basically a number that he can run by this guy? Or is the coach talking to the collective like you were talking about ahead of time before maybe he goes in on that final visit to try and close the deal? Do you know that?
Yeah, so I don't want to say I have not talked to Ryan Day about this, so I don't want to specifically say Ohio State.
Well, anybody.
Day, but I've talked to a lot of coaches. I've talked to a lot of college football staffers about how this works. And so in general, without kind of putting anyone's specific name or program to it, I think I can talk about how it works. So generally what the case would be, it happens a lot now, a player enters the transfer portal, or even if it's a high school recruit and a program is recruiting them. Pretty early on, whether it's directly from a player or now there's a lot of these NIL agents that get involved, which are essentially just an agent representing, this recruit, this player. It's very kind of open and spoken about between these parties, which was, oh yeah, here's my quarterback who just went in the transfer portal. If you want him to come play for your school, you're going to have to pay him $500,000. And a lot of this was kind of happening like under the table because the team would say, all right, understand, wink, wink, we'll go to our collective. Our collective will pay you $500,000 and you will come play for whatever school we are. Now this is actually even a little bit more out in the open because of the recent court case, but I think that's usually the way it went. And there would probably be some negotiation like, oh, we can't pay you $500,000, but you come to this school, we'll pay you $400,000. Here's our track record of NFL draft picks or success on the field, all of those things. And look, it's not a blanket thing. Certain schools would play in those waters a little bit more than others, whether because they could afford it or just kind of the mentality of the coach. I know some coaches who a player would say, if pretty early in the recruiting process, they might say, I want $200,000 to come here. That coach would be like, well, actually that's a red flag for me. And, means I probably don't want that type of player here. And it varies with players too. Some players I genuinely think don't care that much about NIL, and that's certainly not the main reason they pick to go to a place. But yeah, the way this has kind of developed over time and comes to work is a player or a person representing the player has a number in mind. These programs have a general sense of what their budget is for what they can pay and what the market is for certain positions, certain caliber of players. And so it's kind of become professionalized in that sense, the same way free agency and a salary cap works is if you really want a player, maybe you have to overpay for him a little bit. Or if you really have a certain position you have to go after, that's kind of what you're targeting in the transfer portal or in high school recruiting ranks. And the money has become a part of that. And at this point, I don't see that kind of changing. I think this is the way it's going to work moving forward.
Okay. Then we're already starting to hear, and this hasn't even been around very long, NIL. We're starting to hear about NIL fatigue. So, University of Cincinnati, whether you're talking about the Larry Shakeleys of the world, the Jeff Weilers of the world, they have a lot of other money people that help support athletics. They build the indoor facility. They make the changes to Nippert, blah, blah, blah. So, every school has those guys. It's just how many do they have, right? And how generous do they want to be? I got to tell you, I sit there and I wonder if NIL fatigue is not going to be a very, very real thing in a really, really short amount of time. It's one thing to come ask them, hey, let's upgrade the facilities, maybe once every 5, 8, 10 years. But to come every single year and say, hey, man, we got to have some more of that cash because we got to go out and get 15 new players.
No, you're totally right. It's already happening. Seth Emerson, who covers University of Georgia for us at The Athletic, he wrote a piece about it today about this idea of NIL fatigue. And you're right. It's happening at the top booster level, the people who historically programs would go to and say, hey, can we have $5 million to upgrade the locker room? Or maybe a couple $1 million to keep this, hotshot coach that we want to pay a little bit more and keep him from going to another school. Now that's happening on the NIL front where these collectives are saying, hey, we need $1 million to go get this quarterback out of the transfer portal. But it's not just top money boosters. We're now talking about the everyday fan who pays for 4 season tickets in section 213 of the upper deck, and that costs however many $1,000s a year. And they also ask them to kind of give to the scholarship fund or the general fundraising arm of the university. Now these collectives and NIL operations are going to those same fans because they're the ones who are invested, who are giving to the program and saying, well, in addition to your season tickets and whatever other gifts you might give to the university, how about giving us a few $1,000s a year so we can help put that in our pool of money to go after recruits in the transfer portal. And I think for a lot of fans, there's this kind of push and pull of either, well, I'm going to do one or not the other. Or for some of these fans who, frankly, I think love college sports because of the old school amateurism mindset, they'll say, well, I'm happy to give some money for my season tickets or for a nice locker room, but I don't feel comfortable giving money for the NIL collective to go out and get players in the transfer portal. It kind of varies based on the fan and the different fan bases, but you're definitely seeing kind of an oversaturation and really certain programs having to ask a little too much of both the top money donors, but also kind of the everyday fan to compete in terms of the facilities arms race, but also in the NIL collective space.
Northwestern, I think it was back in 2015, they took this idea of theirs to unionize to the National Labor Relations Board. Now, these things are divvied up regionally, as I understand it, and they won that case, the players did, regionally. By the time it got to the national level, that was struck down. Here this week, the basketball players at Dartmouth have said they want to unionize. They've won a legal battle again on the local front. Many are wondering if this one now, this go round, here we are, 9 years after the original Northwestern thing, if this is not going to be the boulder that finally starts to roll downhill. Do you think it is or not quite sure?
There's definitely been a shift in the legal realm and the public consciousness regarding college sports. We talked about the Alston case and some of the other legal battles that are being fought against the NCAA. 8-9 years ago when the Northwestern situation happened, I think the amateurism model, while it was shifting a little bit, was still kind of like the standard within college sports. It was kind of this accepted precedent and reality. That's starting to change just in the past couple of years, and I think that could be what makes this Dartmouth case a little bit different, again, in the public consciousness, in the legal courts where these battles are being fought. There's still a long way to go. You mentioned it starts regionally. Also, the NLRB, as I understand it, only can represent private universities. So Dartmouth basketball voting to unionize doesn't mean that tomorrow Alabama football or Ohio State basketball or any of these major state schools, public institutions couldn't do the same thing. But it has to start somewhere. And you're right that if this one goes up to the next level and it does get approved and that moves forward, then it's all that's going to trickle down to the other programs and other institutions throughout the country. We're talking things that will probably take years to sort out, much like a lot of these other legal cases, but we're starting to see a shift in how they're being adjudicated, which is the courts are almost exclusively favoring against the NCAA in all of these cases, and that's definitely a shift from what we got in the previous existence of it.
Well, if they start to pay players and they unionize like they would, let's just say the janitorial staff at a university, right, where they're all under a union. SEIU is a big one that represents hotel employees and all this kind of stuff all over the country. If that starts to happen, and I know this has been talked a lot about, but from what I've been able to read, no one can make me believe for a fraction of a second that if that starts to happen, I'm not saying it's wrong if it starts to happen. I'm saying if it does happen, that you are going to see the non-revenue generating sports where you have young men and young women getting scholarships. I wouldn't be surprised to see so many of those sports go by the wayside and become club sports.
You're right, and this is kind of the big thing. I think for a long time it's become more accepted, more mainstream to say players deserve to get paid. And because of all the money coming into college sports, yes, we need to find a way to pay the players. What I don't think fans understand is what that will look like in practice. And you're right. That's not to say that it's right or wrong one way or the other. I actually personally, just with all of the money that's tied up into TV rights and all this stuff, it is ridiculous that like the players see no part of that. But when you're talking about unionizing and employment contracts, you are correct that there's going to be a huge ripple effect from that, whether it's, non-revenue sports getting canceled or just the general structure of college sports, which is what people, what fans have loved and rooted for a long time. It's going to look totally different. It's going to be basically unrecognizable for what it's been for most of its existence. And again, not to say that that's right or wrong, but I don't know that the general common fan has totally grasped yet just how impactful all of this is going to be from what the sport looks like on a basic level.
Well, it's exactly right. I mean, you have to, and I think about this frequently when you talk about, people who are yelling and screaming right now, for example, about players getting cut from NFL rosters because of salary caps, right? And all of a sudden they're paying the quarterback $1 gazillion. And those are the same fans that'll say, oh man, this stinks. We can't keep guys around except for 2 or 3 guys, and we harken back to the days when you had guys for 6, 7, 8, 9 years. But then they're also like in favor of, hey man, go out and make all the money you can. Well, you can't have it both ways. It's not going to work. Last thing I want to ask you about, and I don't know really if you're even, familiar enough with it or where it stands. This Michigan story was a huge story during the entire season. I mean, look, you can be the most hardcore Michigan fan on the planet, but I mean, just the sheer fact that this guy who was making 30, 35 grand a year is getting tickets to all of these other places inside the Big Ten, outside the Big Ten, standing on the sidelines of games. Look, who knew, who didn't know, that's what it's all going to come down to. When all is said and done, do you think that Michigan pays a heavy price for what went on there or is alleged to have gone on there?
Yeah, I guess it depends on what constitutes a heavy price, because they can vacate I guess the worst case scenario for Michigan fans would be vacating their national championship, right? That they just won. Does it though? We've seen this in other sports. Do Louisville fans feel like their championship?
No, I don't think that's the worst thing. No, I think it's how it affects you moving forward, because everybody knows they won the championship. They had the best team. They played the best. Okay, that's fine. Mm-hmm. It's over and done with, and you're right about Louisville. But I think the worst case scenario is if all of a sudden now you start hitting them with sanctions on number of scholarships, postseason appearances, that kind of thing, right?
Yeah, the thing that has happened there is the NCAA has moved away from penalties that would impact players who weren't a part of that. And so we've seen that with the Tennessee case, recently, not the most recent one we mentioned, but with Jeremy Pruitt getting, fired and all of that going on there. They basically levy financial fines now, as opposed to saying you can't participate in the postseason or you are getting docked a certain amount of scholarships. They feel like that negatively impacts players on the roster whenever that decision comes down 2, 3, 5 years from now, who had no part in this issue. And so a lot of what you're seeing is we're going to, fine you $15 million or something like that, which is a lot of money. But if you're Michigan and you're making $75 million every year from your TV deal, you probably make that trade, right? You probably say, yeah, well, we won a national championship. Our fans are super excited and love that we won a championship. We sell at our stadium every week. We get a big check from ESPN for being or from Fox and NBC from being in the Big Ten. We'll pay your fine. We'll, keep recruiting, keep going out and playing in the postseason. So it all kind of depends on what that punishment actually is. If they say we're going to dock you 10 scholarships and you can't play in the postseason for 3 or 4 years, then it's a different conversation. But at least the recent precedent of the NCAA has been kind of moving away from that in an effort to not punish players who might have had nothing to do with it.
All right, last thing I want to ask you about, and I'll let you go. You've been very generous with your time here today. On the local front here with Cincinnati, and their television contract with the Big 12 with ESPN. And I'm sure you're asked about this all the time. But I got to tell you, as a guy who worked in television for a long, long time, I just think it's a shame what's happened here to think that last year there were more UC games available on quote-unquote free television. Okay, nothing's free, but you know what I'm getting at here. And I think all but like 4 or 5 of their games in the conference have been on ESPN+. Is that going to change soon?
No, I think it's going to keep going more in that direction, because I think the sports streaming television, it's only going to be more and more. I mean, I totally hear what you're saying in terms of if you're a general fan, you want to be able to pop on ESPN or ESPN2 and watch, Cincinnati play or your favorite team play. We just had an NFL playoff game on Peacock TV that required people to sign up and subscribe for. Purdue and Illinois, 2 of the best teams in college basketball this year, just played a game Tuesday night on Peacock. This is the direction it's all going. There's this, new streamer that might come together between ESPN and
Fox
Warner
and
Brothers
Paramount.
and Fox. Exactly. Like, this is the direction it's going. And so as much as for, certain fan bases or certain generation of fan, this is like terrible and annoying. For a lot of people, there's really no difference, if they're cord cutters or have never had cable. Well, they don't care whether you have to put on the ESPN linear channel or ESPN Plus, because it's all the same to them. So I think it's either going to become there's going to have to be some kind of reckoning in the streaming wars and streaming, space one way or another, because there's too many streamers and it's kind of going back towards the cable model anyways. But I don't think we're going to go backwards in terms of more linear, more cable subscribers. So all of these things that are happening in the streaming space, I think in 10 or 15 years are just going to be kind of the new norm, as frustrating as it might be for people who aren't used to that world right now.
Yeah. Justin, we can't thank you enough for your time, man. You have shed incredible light for those of us walking around in the dark on many of these topics. So thank you so much for your time, and good luck the rest of the way. You got conference tournaments, and then you're rolling right into Big 12 football. So thank you, my friend.
Absolutely. Appreciate you having me on. Thanks, Tom.
Okay. Justin Williams from The Athletic, kind enough to join us. I tell you, Casey, I could talk about that stuff all day long, that NIL and all this, because I just don't get it. Did you understand a lot of it before he came on?
I mean, I had a rough idea, but I mean, it's a lot of just underhanded things that were going on before, right? And now they've just kind of put it out in the open. So I don't know if it's a good thing or not, Tom. I really don't.
I don't know either, but it's not going to change. And when you start really reading a lot about this, as I did in preparation of this interview and reading the latest on this Dartmouth thing about unionizing, and then you now all of a sudden, you need a law degree to figure out the National Labor Relations Board, and it's regionalized and it's nationalized, and private universities and public universities and all this kind of stuff that goes on. It just seems like there's no end in sight. And so much of this is being affected by apparently all these multi-hundreds of $1 million lawsuits that the NCAA is facing from these different places right now. So they can't really navigate into some of this stuff because it's going to be dependent upon that case in Texas, that case in Tennessee, that case in Virginia, that case in D.C. It's a long way from just turning on the Saturday afternoon football game and watching your favorite team. It's a long ways away. All right, we thank all of you. We thank Casey. We thank all of you for being with us, and we'll look forward to seeing you Monday morning. That'll be at 9:15 live on Chatterbox Sports and posting later in the day on the Believe Network. Have a wonderful St. Patrick's Day weekend and enjoy some green beer. Maybe.